and in 16. But I do think we saw some lighter turnout in some of the areas we had hoped, but difference of a point here or there, which obviously in a close race makes a huge difference. And then I think we saw a little bit of a drop in support in a few areas for us. So that ultimately, I think, is why we weren't able to close the gap. It wasn't so much that what we were seeing in the battlegrounds was out of expectation or that he had some hidden turnout we hadn't picked up on.
David, when you say it was a margin of error race, you needed high turnout, what did your polls tell you where the race was heading into Election Day?
Well, Dan, you and I talked prior to the election, and just to rewind, I think when Kamala Harris became the nominee, she was behind. We kind of, climbed back. And even post-debate, we still had ourselves down, in the battleground states, but very close. And so I think by the end, it was a jump ball race. And I think we needed some things to break our way. Maybe Trump's election day turnout would underperform. Our election day turnout would, either be at level or overperform. And, we'd win more of the people who decided in the last 3 or 4 days. I think our data and the New York Times data and other public data suggested we did have some progress with undecideds at late October. So it was a dead heat race. But, at the end of the day, the political atmosphere was pretty brutal. And that's not an excuse. You had right track, wrong track, I think 28-72, about 70% of the country saying they were angry and dissatisfied. You had Trump's approval rating on his first term, frustratingly high, 48-51, depending on the state. Obviously, the incumbent president's approval rating around 38-41, depending on the state. I think the economy and inflation still driving a lot of votes. So I think given that we had a challenging political environment, the fact that we got the race to dead heat was positive, but boy, it was slow moving. And I think we were focused on 7 states. That's our windshield into the world, the battleground states. But, what we saw on election day was, New Jersey and California and Connecticut and New York, massive shifts. So I think where Kamala Harris campaigned, we were able to keep the tide down a little bit, but it ended up being a pretty strong, tailwind for Donald Trump. And I think it's worth reminding everybody, we saw in 22, even though that was a pretty decent Democratic year, we saw these shifts. We saw them in 20, we saw them in 16. Trump specifically, but Republicans generally improving their vote share amongst non-college voters, particularly non-college voters of color. And this was a surprising race because Kamala Harris actually did, I think, better with senior voters than I think a lot of people would have thought. So margin of error race where we inherited a deficit, we got it to even, but the thing never moved. So to Jen's point, I think we were hopeful. I don't know how optimistic we were, but we thought, okay, this is tied. And if a couple things break our way, and listen, I'm naive in this way. I just thought at the end of the day, particularly because Trump did not close well, I thought, and I thought Kamala Harris closed well. Trump was reminding people some of the things they don't like about him, that might give us what we needed. But at the end of the day, I think the political atmosphere, the desire for change, all those fundamentals that you've spent a lot of time talking about really presented huge challenges for us. So, we got there, but we didn't get the breaks we needed on election day.
How deep was the hole that she had to climb out of?
Well, Jen, I think, listen, there was the Biden-Trump 1.0, which is obviously pretty catastrophic in terms of where the race stood. When we got in, my recollection is some of that snapped back, but, we were behind. I think it surprised people because there was these public polls that came out in late September, early October, showing us with leads that we never saw. It was just basically a race that in the battlegrounds was 46-47, 47-48. So that's not where we started. We started behind. She was able to climb out. I think even after the debate, we might have gained, 0.51. It wasn't a race that moved a lot. And so I think when you think about our own internal analytics, if you have Wisconsin at 47-47, or Pennsylvania 48-47 Trump, let's say, which I think is where we had it at the end, you've got to have undecideds break your way more than your opponents, and you've got to get a little benefit from turnout, which we weren't able to do.
Obviously, the defining event of this race was the candidate switch, and every decision you guys had to make, everything you had to do was defined also by the compressed calendar in which you were operating in. Quentin, you were there when that switch happened. How were you able, there was a 1 month period between the debate and when the president actually dropped out. obviously it seemed like a dropping out could be a possibility. Were you able to do any thinking or planning in that 1 month period about what a race with the vice president would look like? Or did you have to sort of start cold on that first day, the moment you got the call or the statement went out?
I mean, we started cold. There was no planning involved in any other candidates. I mean, we were honestly in crisis management mode of keeping President Biden in the race, convincing, Democratic allies that he could still do this. And one of the things was trying to keep the president out on the road as much. We were still doing everything we could from a campaign, and he made the decision that he did not want to continue on. And he pulled some of the senior leadership together and said that he was going to be with the vice president. It also wasn't anything that our team took for granted to just say, okay, she is the nominee. We knew that there was still a situation where we had to shore up delegates, and that's where we started from. And then after that point, that is when we began to say, okay, how can we define her? Also, Trump's favorabilities numbers were creeping up, as Pluff said, and we had to do something about that as well. And so it was a lot of walking and chewing gum at the same time, but there really was no sort of contingency planning to turn the race over to her right after that debate or at any point until President Biden definitively said he wasn't going to continue on.
Stephanie, I think what probably surprised a lot of people in politics was the vice president was a largely unknown quantity to much of the electorate. Mm-hmm. So you guys, under a very short time frame, had to do two things. As Quinn said, you had to teach people about her and also make a case against Donald Trump, who had just come off, he was at an all-time high, come off the assassination attempt, the debate against the president. In terms of messaging, how did you think about the balance between the two?
Well, the first thing we had to do is put on a convention, and we had about 3 weeks to flip a convention that was being built around Joe Biden. So we were able to flip it, to fit this very new character of a different generation, different experience, different background. And looking at the data at the time, which Jen and Pluff and Quentin have all talked about, she had a huge deficit in favorability because either people didn't know about her or what they did know about her was based off of negative media. So our first priority was to define her in that convention, fill in her bio. As part of that, we already knew how to do the negative on Trump, and we knew that there was a lot of Trumpnesia out there. People didn't remember the 4 years of the Trump administration that badly because they had been through hell. They had been through COVID, both under his watch and under President Biden's. I'm putting aside a lot of the details of who's at fault and what Biden did to dig us out and all of that. And then they had to deal with inflation. So they had been through hell. So looking back, you remember a previous time much more fondly because you've now think that you've gone through the worst. So we had to remind people what life was like. That was our second imperative. And then the third imperative as part of the convention and leading into the remaining days of the campaign is what's that choice? What are the two very different visions between Trump and Kamala Harris? So the convention, it demonstrated a lot of enthusiasm for Kamala Harris, a lot of freshness, future-oriented, bringing a variety of coalitions together. We had independents, Republicans, Democrats, business leaders, sports figures, everybody coming together around a new way forward and finally turning the page. Through the rest of that campaign, our next thing was the debate just a few weeks later, and it was boom, 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 all the way through probably early October after the Walz debate, that we had to move through these things so quickly. Once we got through all of that, then the race started to gel. And, to the extent people were open to remembering what life was like under Trump, we were trying to fill that in. To the extent people had questions about Kamala Harris, we were still trying to fill that in. So in 107 days, what typically takes us a year and a half, 2 years in a presidential campaign, we were defining someone who was wholly undefined from the start, trying to remind people about the opponent and what life was like underneath him, and also take into account what the political environment was and the realities that we had to deal with, which, she was the incumbent, but she really wasn't the incumbent. People didn't know that much about her. The economy was still slightly getting better, but we couldn't really take credit for it. So we were in a bit of a crossroads trying to figure out what that October